Today, heels are seen as a symbol of beauty and feminism. But originally, high heels were made for men. They were symbols of masculinity and war. Heels were not fashion at all, they were a practical tool. Persian soldiers were the first to wear them. In the 1600s, Persian soldiers wore high-heeled shoes when going to war so they could lock their feet into stirrups while riding horses, preventing their feet from slipping. From there, the idea traveled to Europe. High heels didn't start as fashion. And they definitely didn't start for women. They started with horses. Let's go back to the late 1500s, early 1600s. Persia. Back then, Persian cavalry soldiers were some of the most feared fighters in the world. These men fought on horseback, and control meant everything. When you're riding fast, holding weapons, aiming arrows, even a small slip can get you killed. That's where the heel comes in. The heel wasn't about looking tall. It wasn't about style. It had one simple job: to lock the foot into the stirrup. That small raised heel helped soldiers stand up while riding. It gave balance, stability, power. It made fighting easier, safer, more effective. So yes, high heels were military gear. Now here's where things get interesting. European travelers visited Persia. Diplomats, merchants, military observers. And they noticed something. These Persian men looked powerful, confident, dominant, tall in the saddle, literally elevated. Europe didn't copy the fighting. They copied the look. By the early 1600s, European aristocratic men started wearing heels. Not for horses, but for status. Wearing heels said something without words. It said, "I don't work with my hands. I don't walk long distances. I ride." Heels became a quiet symbol of class. And the higher the heel, the higher the rank. Kings wore them. Nobles wore them. Rich men wore them. Poor men couldn't. Simple as that. This wasn't fashion the way we think of fashion today. It was power dressing, political dressing, social signaling. And nobody questioned it. Because at that time, heels meant masculinity, authority, control. In fact, if you didn't wear them, you looked weak, ordinary, replaceable. The heel wasn't trying to be attractive. It was trying to be untouchable. And that meaning stuck around longer than most people realize. As heels spread across Europe, they didn't get softer. They got louder. Men started wearing thicker heels, higher heels, brighter heels, especially in France. And no one pushed this more than King Louis XIV. Louis wasn't tall, but he was obsessed with power, image, presence. So he wore heels. Red ones. Not just any red. A deep, expensive red dye that only the rich could afford. And soon, red heels became a status symbol. Some historians even note that only people close to the king were allowed to wear them. Your shoes literally showed your place in society. And here's something people don't talk about much. Men's heels back then were often more dramatic than women's. They were chunky, bold, proud. They said, "Look at me. I matter." At the same time, women were still wearing flat shoes. Practical shoes. Heels were still considered masculine. But culture doesn't stay still. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, ideas about masculinity began to shift. Men slowly moved towards simpler clothing. Dark colors. Clean lines. Less decoration. Power started to look serious, instead of ornamental. Heels didn't disappear overnight. But they started losing their meaning for men. And that's when something quiet happened. Women adopted them. Not because heels suddenly became feminine, but because men left them behind. At first, women wore heels to copy male power, to appear higher status, more authoritative. Portraits from the time show women standing stiff, elevated, almost borrowing masculinity through posture. But over time, society flipped the meaning. What once symbolized strength and dominance slowly became linked to beauty, elegance, and desirability. especially as men decided they didn't want anything associated with decoration anymore. The same object. A completely different story. And here's the uncomfortable part. We didn't forget this history by accident. We simplified it. Cleaned it up. Made it fit modern ideas about gender. But history doesn't care about our comfort. It just keeps receipts. Today, when people argue about high heels, they talk about beauty, fashion, gender roles, comfort, sometimes control. But almost no one talks about where heels actually came from. Because if they did, the conversation would feel different. Heels weren't invented to attract. They were invented to dominate space. They made the wearer taller, louder, harder to ignore. They changed posture, forced the body into a stance that demanded attention. That's not accidental. What's wild is how easily meanings flip when power shifts. When men wore heels, they were symbols of authority. When women wore heels, they slowly became symbols of expectation. Same object, different rules. And maybe that's the real story here. Not about men, not about women, but about how culture rewrites objects to serve whoever holds power at the time. High heels didn't change. We did. So the next time someone says, heels were always meant for women, just remember, history is longer than opinions. A Persian soldier needed balance. A European king wanted status. A society needed symbols. And somehow, a piece of military equipment turned into one of the most debated items of clothing in the world. That's not fashion history. That's human behavior. We take tools. We assign meaning. Then we forget why they existed in the first place. And maybe that forgetting says more about us than the heel ever could. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. And what we choose to ignore. So high heels traveled from Persia to Europe, and then spread across the world. Men started wearing them first, and over time they turned into a symbol of feminism.